What if I told you that for more than 1,300 years, Muslims and Jews did not fight wars against each other? Not just fewer wars, but no sustained, large-scale wars at all. That idea may sound almost impossible today, especially given how modern narratives shape our understanding of history. So is this actually true, or is it an oversimplification? Let's start from the beginning. During the time of Muhammad, there were conflicts with certain Jewish tribes. Doesn't that seem to contradict the idea that there were no wars?
At first glance, it might seem like a contradiction, but when we examine those events closely, a different picture emerges. The conflicts that took place in 7th century Arabia were highly localized and tied to the tribal and political realities of that time. Arabia was not a unified state, but a network of tribes whose relationships were governed by alliances, treaties, and shifting loyalties. The clashes with groups such as Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza occurred within this context, and they were fundamentally political and security-driven rather than religious wars against Jews as a whole. Even the Battle of Khaybar was directed at specific groups that were part of the regional power dynamics, not at Judaism as a religion or Jews as a global community. It is also essential to recognize that during the lifetime of Muhammad himself, there were formal treaties and agreements established with Jewish communities, both before and after these conflicts. These agreements regulated coexistence, mutual obligations, and security arrangements, reflecting an ongoing framework of political negotiation rather than permanent hostility. In fact, Jewish communities continued to live alongside Muslims peacefully in various parts of Arabia, including in and around Medina, and later in regions under Muslim control. This further reinforces the point that the relationship was not defined by continuous conflict, but by a mixture of alliance, coexistence, and occasional localized disputes. What is important to understand is that these events did not evolve into a continuous or expanding conflict. Instead, they remained confined to that early historical moment and did not set a precedent for ongoing warfare between Muslims and Jews.
So, after that early period, what actually happened? If there were no wars, how did Muslims and Jews interact over the centuries?
After the initial formation of the Islamic world, the relationship between Muslims and Jews shifted into a completely different pattern, one that was defined primarily by coexistence rather than confrontation. As Islamic empires expanded, Jewish communities became integrated into these societies, not as outsiders in constant conflict, but as recognized and protected minorities. In cities such as Baghdad during the Abbasid period, Córdoba in Islamic Spain, and later Istanbul under the Ottoman Empire, Jews participated actively in economic, intellectual, and even administrative life. They served as physicians, merchants, translators, scholars, and advisors, contributing significantly to the flourishing of these civilizations. This was not a marginal or hidden existence. It was a visible and meaningful presence within the broader social fabric. The absence of war was not simply due to a lack of opportunity for conflict, but rather the result of a system that allowed different religious communities to coexist within a shared political structure.
That's fascinating, but it raises a deeper question. Was there any tensions that escalated into wars, especially given that religious differences can often lead to conflict?
The answer lies in a combination of religious, political, and structural factors that worked together to prevent large-scale conflict. One of the most important elements was the Islamic classification of Jews as people of the book, which acknowledged them as part of a shared monotheistic tradition. This recognition created a theological framework in which Jews were not viewed as existential enemies, but as a community with legitimate religious standing. At the same time, the legal structure provided a practical mechanism for coexistence. Under this system, Jewish communities were granted protection, religious freedom, and a degree of internal autonomy, while accepting a subordinate political status and paying a specific tax. This arrangement established a stable and predictable relationship that reduced the likelihood of violent conflict. Perhaps most importantly, the religious concepts of the Promised Land and the Messiah were not interpreted in political or military terms for most of this period. These ideas were understood as spiritual hopes that would be fulfilled through divine intervention rather than human action. As a result, they did not translate into territorial ambitions or military campaigns.
Can you give us a clearer picture of what this coexistence actually looked like in everyday life?
In practical terms, coexistence meant that Jews and Muslims interacted regularly in both public and private spheres. In major urban centers, they shared markets, participated in trade networks, and engaged in intellectual collaboration. In Baghdad, for example, Jewish scholars played a significant role in the translation movement that preserved and transmitted Greek philosophy and science into the Arabic-speaking world. In Cordoba, Jewish and Muslim thinkers contributed together to advancements in medicine, philosophy, and literature. This coexistence also extended to moments of crisis. When Jews were expelled from Christian Spain in 1492, many of them sought refuge in Muslim lands, particularly within the Ottoman Empire, where they were received and resettled. This migration was not accidental. It reflected a broader perception that Muslim societies offered comparatively safer and more stable conditions for Jewish life.
It sounds quite positive overall, but was it really that smooth, or were there underlying tensions?
It is important to avoid idealizing the past. While coexistence was the dominant pattern, it was not free from inequality or occasional conflict. In some cases, Jewish communities occupied a lower social and political status, and there were periods when discrimination or local violence occurred. However, these incidents were generally limited in scope and did not escalate into sustained wars or systemic attempts at elimination. The key point is that, despite these imperfections, the overall structure of society favored stability and coexistence.
So if this pattern lasted for so long, what changed? Why do we see conflict emerging in the modern era?
The turning point came with the profound transformations of the 19th and 20th centuries. The rise of nationalism, the decline of traditional empires, and the influence of European colonial powers reshaped the political landscape of the Middle East. Within this context, the emergence of Zionism marked a significant shift in how the idea of the Promised Land was understood. For the first time in many centuries, the return to the land was framed not as a spiritual event to be awaited, but as a political project to be actively pursued. This change introduced a new dynamic in which Jewish migration to Palestine intersected with the existing Arab population's sense of identity, land, and sovereignty. As a result, the conditions that had previously prevented large-scale conflict were replaced by a situation in which two groups were competing over the same territory, leading eventually to the conflicts of the modern era.
So the historical picture is very different from what many people assume.
Yes, it is. For more than 1,300 years, Muslims and Jews largely coexisted within shared political and social systems without engaging in sustained wars against each other. The absence of conflict was not accidental, but the result of specific religious interpretations, political structures, and historical circumstances. Understanding this long period of coexistence helps us see that the conflicts of the modern era are not inevitable or timeless, but rather the product of relatively recent changes.
Which leaves us with a powerful question.
Exactly. The real question is not why Muslims and Jews have fought, but why they managed to live together for so long and what lessons that history might still hold today.
Meaning they were recognized as part of the same monotheistic family tree.
Exactly. Islam acknowledged that Jews had received legitimate divine revelation. This recognition created a theological safety net. Jews were not viewed as existential enemies or pagans that needed to be eradicated. They were a community with a legitimate, recognized religious standing. That theological framework was then translated into a practical legal structure.
Right, the Dhimmi system. I want to unpack this, because modern ears hear about a system where a minority group pays a specific tax and accepts a subordinate political status, and they immediately equate it with oppression. But in the context of the Middle Ages, this was actually a mechanism of stability, wasn't it?
That is a brilliant observation, and it is vital to judge history by the standards of its time, not by the standards of modern liberal democracies. Under this legal structure, Jewish communities were granted state protection, freedom of worship, and a remarkable degree of internal legal autonomy. They ran their own courts and managed their own community affairs. In exchange, they accepted a subordinate political status and paid a specific tax.
It was like an operating system for society. It might have had built-in hierarchies, but it didn't crash. It kept the peace. But what about the concept of the Promised Land? Because when we look at the conflict today, territory and the idea of a divine right to the land are at the absolute center of the violence. Why wasn't that a trigger for war back then?
Because for the vast majority of this 1300-year period, the religious concepts of the Promised Land and the Messiah were interpreted in strictly spiritual terms. They were not political manifestos.
That is fascinating. So the longing for the land was a matter of prayer, not a military strategy.
Precisely. The return to the land was understood as a profound spiritual hope that would eventually be fulfilled through direct divine intervention. It was something God would do at the end of days, not something humans were supposed to achieve through military campaigns or territorial conquest. Because these ideas were kept in the realm of the spiritual, they did not translate into territorial ambitions, which meant they did not threaten the political order of the Islamic empires.
That completely changes the paradigm. It really highlights how modern our current understanding of these concepts actually is. And this system of coexistence wasn't just a fair weather phenomenon, was it? It held up even during massive global crises. I am thinking specifically of 1492.
1492 is perhaps the ultimate stress test of this historical relationship. When the Catholic monarchs of Spain issued the Alhambra decree, expelling the entire Jewish population from the Iberian Peninsula, it was a moment of absolute catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were suddenly stateless refugees. And where did the vast majority of them seek refuge?
They went to the Islamic world.
They went straight to the Ottoman Empire. And this was not a desperate, accidental migration. The Ottoman Sultan actively welcomed them, sending ships to bring them safely to his lands. He recognized their economic and intellectual value, but it also reflected a broader, universally understood reality at the time. Muslim societies offered comparatively safer, more stable, and more tolerant conditions for Jewish life than Christian Europe.
It is an incredible historical irony. The lands that modern narratives tell us are inherently hostile to Jews were, for centuries, their greatest sanctuary. But I want to push back just a little bit to make sure we aren't painting an unrealistic utopia. It couldn't have been perfectly smooth for over a millennium. There had to be dark chapters.
It is absolutely essential to avoid romanticizing or idealizing the past. Coexistence was the dominant pattern, but it was not a flawless utopia. As we mentioned, the system was built on a hierarchy, which meant there was inherent inequality. There were periods where that hierarchy hardened into discrimination. There were isolated incidents of local violence, forced conversions, or oppressive rulers who violated the spirit of the agreements.
But the key distinction is the scale and the intent.
Exactly. Those dark chapters were the exception, not the rule. They were generally limited in scope, tied to specific unstable regimes or economic crises, and most importantly, they never escalated into sustained generational wars or systemic continent-wide attempts at elimination. Despite its imperfections, the overarching architecture of the society heavily favored stability, integration, and coexistence.
So we have this incredibly resilient architecture, a system that survives the fall of empires, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and countless geopolitical earthquakes. It lasts for over 1,300 years, and then it fractures. If this pattern was so deeply ingrained, what changed? Why do we see such intense, intractable conflict emerging in the modern era?
The turning point is surprisingly recent. The fracture occurs with the profound, radical transformations of the 19th and 20th centuries. The entire political landscape of the world, and specifically the Middle East, was violently reshaped. You had the slow, agonizing decline of traditional empires, particularly the Ottoman Empire. You had the aggressive intrusion of European colonial powers, drawing arbitrary lines on maps. But most importantly, you had the rise of a completely new European ideology, nationalism.
The idea that every distinct ethnic or cultural group must have its own sovereign nation-state.
Yes, and within this volatile new context, the emergence of Zionism marked a seismic shift in how the idea of the Promised Land was understood.
The spiritual suddenly became political.
Exactly. For the first time in many centuries, the longing to return to the land was no longer framed as a spiritual event, to be patiently awaited through divine intervention. It was transformed into a modern political project. It became a nationalist movement to be actively pursued through migration, diplomacy, and eventually state building.
And that fundamentally changed the geometry of the relationship, because suddenly it wasn't about two religious communities coexisting under a larger imperial umbrella. It became a zero-sum game.
That is the tragedy of the shift. This new dynamic meant that Jewish migration to Palestine directly intersected and inevitably collided with the existing Arab population's deep sense of identity, their connection to the land, and their own emerging aspirations for sovereignty. The conditions that had previously prevented large-scale conflict, the shared political structures, the theological safety nets, the spiritualized view of territory were all swept away. They were replaced by a modern nationalist paradigm where two distinct groups were now competing over the exact same piece of territory.
It is chilling when you lay it out like that. We traded empires of coexistence for nation-states of exclusivity. The historical picture is just profoundly different from what almost everyone assumes. We are conditioned to think we are watching an ancient religious war, but we are actually watching a modern territorial and nationalist conflict.
Yes, we are, and acknowledging that is the first step toward any kind of intellectual honesty about the region. For more than 1,300 years, Muslims and Jews largely coexisted within shared political and social systems. They built civilizations together. They did not engage in sustained wars against each other. The absence of conflict was not a historical accident. It was the deliberate result of specific religious interpretations, pragmatic political structures, and a shared cultural space.
Understanding this long period of coexistence doesn't just correct the historical record, it actually provides a strange kind of hope. Because if the conflict we see today is not an ancient, inevitable, or timeless hatred, but rather the product of relatively recent political changes, that means it isn't permanently hardwired into the DNA of these two peoples.
Exactly. If the hostility was created by historical circumstances, it means it can, theoretically, be unmade by future circumstances. History proves that these two communities possess an immense capacity for mutual respect and shared prosperity.
Which leaves us with the incredibly powerful question to ponder. We spend so much time analyzing the violence of the last century, trying to untangle the modern geopolitical knot.
But the real question, the one that holds the most profound implications for our future, is not why Muslims and Jews have fought in the modern era, The real question is how they managed to live together so successfully for over a millennium, and what forgotten lessons that vast, peaceful history might still hold for us today.
It forces us to look in the rearview mirror to find a map for the future. It is a perspective that completely rewrites the narrative. If this conversation challenged your assumptions and changed how you see history, make sure to follow us for more deep, thought-provoking explorations into the forces that shape our world.